We're comparing a bunch of molds from different manufacturers to find out how plastic affects stability. But first, why would the plastic change a disc's stability at all? The plastic is in the details. Hey everyone, it's Greg from Six Sided Discs. To understand how plastic would play a role in how a disc flies, we first have to understand how discs fly. The following explanation is a paraphrasing from scientificamerican.com. There are two key forces that act on a disc during flight: lift and drag. Lift is the force that allows the disc to stay airborne, and in flight it opposes the force of gravity on the disc's mass. The disc itself creates this lift force as it flies through the air. Because of the disc's curved shape, the airflow above it must travel at a higher velocity than that underneath. And as it travels along the curved edge, it follows that path and pushes down. This generates some lift on its own because, as we know, any force applied creates an equal and opposite force. But the faster air above also creates low pressure above and high pressure below the disc. This pressure difference provides even more lift. Drag is a resistant force on the disc, perpendicular to the lift, and it acts against the disc's movement through the air. The angle at which the disc is thrown, often called launch angle or the angle of attack, affects both lift and drag. You've probably noticed that a disc doesn't travel very far without spin. Spinning the disc helps it fly by supplying angular momentum, which helps keep the disc stable. The faster it spins, the more stable it should be. So to summarize, lift helps the disc stay in the air, while the spin creates stability. Now we know that disc golf discs are essentially a circular wing, and the edge of the wing is what primarily determines the stability of the disc. Typically, discs that are very aerodynamic are more understable, while less aerodynamic discs create a lot of drag to create overstability. Why would the blend of the plastic used to make the disc have such a huge impact on the stability of the disc? Well, there are a couple key factors at play. The first is how quickly the disc cools and how that can affect the entire shape of the disc. For example, if you look at these two Firebirds, you'll see some significant differences. The Star Firebird is relatively flat, while this DX Firebird has a little bit more of a dome. Beyond being flat or domey, the cooling of a disc can have an impact on the actual shape of the wing on the end of the rim. This changes the angle of attack and therefore the flight. One other thing that this can change is known as the parting line. Many disc golfers that have researched the flight and stability of discs will tell you that one of the best indicators for how a disc will fly relative to other discs of the same mold is the parting line height. Disc golf discs are typically made with a top and bottom mold. The parting line is where they meet in the center, and plastic often leaks out of that gap slightly and needs to be trimmed, leaving a faint line. The higher the parting line or closer to the flight plate, the more overstable the disc will typically fly, relative to other discs of the same mold. The inverse, however, is also true. The lower the parting line, the less stability. Another key factor is the density of the plastic. We're going to use MVP's fission plastic as an example. Fission plastic uses MVP's microbubble technology to add tiny air bubbles into the plastic, drastically reducing the weight of the flight plate relative to the rim, because fission plastic still uses MVP's traditional gyro rim technology, which uses a super dense outer rim and a much lighter flight plate, putting as much of the weight out to the outer edge of the wing as possible. This increases the gyroscopic stability of the disc, allowing it to maintain its stability in flight longer. This also creates a greater weight difference between the flight plate and the wing. However, if a plastic is less dense, which you can often feel in plastics like DX from Innova or Putter Blend from Discraft, the flight plate requires more material for it to be sturdy enough to hold up over time. This creates a lesser weight difference between the flight plate and the outer rim, and therefore less stability. Lastly, we can't talk stability without talking about flight numbers. If you've seen our Flight Numbers Don't Matter series, then you know that we love to hate to love flight numbers. But the reason that I bring that up is because many manufacturers take the approach of setting flight numbers for a specific mold, and then those remain the same regardless of what plastic they use. MVP Disc Sports is one exception. As we talked about in previous videos, MVP is one of the only companies that changes the flight numbers based on the plastic, rating both their electron or cosmic electron base plastics as well as fission slightly more understable than the rest of their plastics. While MVP is one of the only ones that does this, they are not the only one who's taking flight numbers a little more seriously. And we have to give a lot of credit to Elevation Discs. Elevation Discs is the only brand in disc golf, to our knowledge, to change the flight numbers for a disc for each run of that disc. For example, the Run 1 Binks is rated as an 8501 straight fairway driver, but the newer, stiffer Run and EcoFlex rubber is rated at 85-31, much more understable. Similarly, the three different runs of Elevation Interceptor all have different flight numbers, with 5303, 54-12, and 54-21 respectively. So why don't other companies do this? Should we hold them to higher standards to help players have a better expectation of how a disc will fly? I don't know the right answer, but I'm curious your thoughts. So think about and comment below how you think manufacturers should handle flight numbers as it pertains to plastic. With all that being said, what are we actually looking for when we test these discs? First, we're going to put several plastic-related myths to the test. The first is that premium plastic is always more overstable than base or mid-grade plastic. The next is that metal flake or glow plastics are more overstable than other premium plastics. And we'll also be testing to see if parting line height matches with the stability we observe in the discs that we're testing. And of course, we'll be looking for any other patterns that appear while we test and compare. We have 6 different molds going head-to-head today, and we'll start with the proxy. We have 3 proxies to test today. Cosmic Electron Soft, which is a mid-grade plastic, rated slightly more understable than Eclipse, MVP's Glow plastic. And we'll also be throwing a Fission proxy, which is their sometimes lightweight microbubble premium plastic. All 3 of these are between 174 and 175 grams. First, let's take a look at the Fission proxy, which gets a good flight, even though I tried to trip when I threw it, and gets plenty of turn before a nice gentle forward fade. Let's compare that to the Cosmic Electron proxy, which even though it gets started out a little bit to the right by comparison, turns way more than the Fission proxy and never really fades. Finally, we have the Eclipse proxy, which has a pretty similar flight to the Fission proxy, perhaps just ever so slightly more overstable. So, in this case, was premium plastic more overstable than base or mid-grade plastic? Absolutely. If we compare the parting line height on these proxies, the highest, Eclipse, was ever so slightly the most overstable, only a fraction higher than the Fission proxy, while the Cosmic Electron proxy is clearly the lowest parting line height and also the least stable. So in this case, parting line height lined up perfectly with the observed stability of these discs. I don't know if it's safe to say it blew my mind, but I was very surprised to see how well that lined up, and I look forward to seeing how it compares with other discs. Next up, let's take a look at the 171 gram Walker from Lone Star Disc in Delta Plastic and a 170 gram Walker in Lone Star Glow. Interestingly, looking at these side by side across several shots, there is very little to choose between the two. I'd say it's safe to say that this defies that myth that premium plastic is always more overstable, and that goes for Glow as well. The Delta plastic is really stiff, while the Lone Star Glow is really kind of gummy. Surprisingly, they flew almost exactly the same. And if we line them up for a side-by-side comparison, we find that they have exactly the same parting line height. That's 2 for 2 on parting line height so far. Moving from one overstable disc to another, let's check out the Castoplast yarn. Here we're going to take a look at a couple throws with the 173 gram Glow yarn. which gets a surprising amount of turn. Compare that to the 173 gram K1 yarn, which is clearly way more overstable. So where do you think the 175 gram K3 yarn fits in? Is the mid-grade plastic going to be as understable as Glow? Nope, you're wrong. It is so overstable. This is completely backwards to what we would expect. The mid-grade plastic K3 yarn is way more overstable than both the K1 and K1 Glow. And there's actually a crazy variety here of stability between the three yarns. Now, parting line height might have matched up perfectly with these other discs that we looked at so far, but with the yarn, that is not the case. If we look at the parting line height on the yarns, it's difficult to see a clear difference. So in this case, we can't really conclude that parting line height played much of a role. Next, let's move on to the Firebird with a 170 gram DX Firebird and a 171 gram Star Firebird. Now, to be clear, I expected the DX Firebird to be really silly understable. And I assumed comparing it to this misprint Star Firebird from a custom run we did last year would show a clear difference in stability. But once again, expectations don't always line up with reality. This Star Firebird was crazy understable on almost every throw. It would just pop up, turn, and turn, and turn. Now, granted, there was like a faint headwind today, but nothing that should be turning over a Firebird of all things. The DX Firebird wasn't much better. Both of them were quite understable. In trying to understand why, we might have found a clue, and that is with the parting line height. If you look at the DX and Star Firebird side by side, they have nearly identical parting line height, so there isn't really much to choose against them. But if we compare that Star Firebird against an old pre-flight number Champion Firebird that I've had since the early 2000s, there's a pretty noticeable difference. This Champion Firebird actually has some stability, and the parting line height is way higher. In fact, they almost look like completely different discs. It's pretty wild how much variation we saw between those two. It just goes to show you how much difference there can be in one plastic to another. Now let's take a look at some Metal Flake plastic with the 171 gram Meta Essence and a 170 gram Neo Essence. Discmania's Meta plastic, similar to Opto X or Lucid X from Latitude or Dynamic respectively, is a glittery metal flaky plastic that has a similar overall feel to Neo plastic, but with the added sparkle of the glitter. The big question here is whether we're going to see a difference in stability between the two. Specifically, we would kind of expect Metal Flake-ish plastic to be more overstable. Caleb used to throw a lot of Discmania, and interestingly, right before he threw the Meta Essence, he said he expected it to be super understable. And it looks like he was right, because it got a ton of turn. If we compare that to the Neo Essence, we see the Neo Essence getting just a little bit less turn and a more pronounced fade. Once again, this is kind of at odds with the established expectation. And if we look to parting line height for clues, unfortunately here we don't find them. Firstly, it's very difficult to even see the parting line on the Discmania discs here with the naked eye. It's even more difficult to see on camera, but I can tell you from what I can see that there's really no discernible difference. Finally, to Prodigy with our last disc for today, the A2. The A2 is designed to be a very overstable approach disc, and we'll be testing it in 300 plastic, which is a grippy base level plastic, as well as 2 premium plastic blends in 400 and 750 Spectrum. Let's start off with the 300 plastic A2, and as you can see, it is super overstable, which is not super unexpected as it is an overstable approach disc. Next, let's take a look at the A2 in 750 Spectrum plastic. And once again, crazy overstable. And the A2 in 400 plastic holds kind of straight for kind of a long time. This is really unexpected. The 400 A2 really held much longer before getting a nice decent fade at the end. Nowhere near as overstable as the other two. And once again, if we compare parting line height on the A2, we see the 750 Spectrum is only a fraction higher than the 400, and the 300 plastic is basically the same as the Spectrum plastic. But it doesn't seem like enough to justify that much difference between the two discs. So what have we learned? Well, for some molds, like the Proxy, the parting line height matches perfectly with the stability of these discs. For others, like the Firebird, the A2, and the Essence, we see slight variations in flight with little to no difference in parting line height. We also see discs like the 300 A2 or K3 Yarn, or even the Delta Walker defying expectations and being just as overstable as their premium plastic counterparts, if not more so. And the Metal Flake Meta Essence being slightly more understable than the Neo Essence, once again, subverts these expectations. I think the Proxy is by far the most interesting result. 3 molds, 3 different levels of stability that perfectly match their parting line height, but don't perfectly match their flight numbers. But clearly there isn't one rule that applies 100% of the time in disc golf. There's simply too many variables at play when it comes to how a disc will fly. Whether it's the manufacturing process, the materials used, where they're made, when they're made, how you throw them and where you throw them, there's no telling exactly how a disc is going to fly until you take it out there and throw it for yourself. Remember, this is only part 1. Check out part 2 next week to see just a few other discs tested out. We have 5 different plastics for the Buzz, 4 different plastics for the MVP Volt, and much more. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also enjoy our other series, Flight Numbers Don't Matter, where we test discs with the same flight numbers to see if they actually fly the same, or other variations on that theme. We also have the Disc is in the Details, where we do deep dives on the specific little details that make discs unique. But for now, and for Six-Sided Discs, I'm Greg. We'll see you in the next one. If you like this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, or supporting us on Patreon. Your support makes this content possible. We'll talk more about this picture in just a moment, but as you can see, this line here along the outer edge of the rim shows where the 2 pieces of the mold overlapped. The parting line height represents where the 2 pieces of the mold. The parting line height is where plastic was able to leak out slightly where the 2 pieces. Disc golf discs are manufactured using a top and bottom mold, and the parting line height is created by plastic leaking out of the side of the. And the parting line height is created by plastic leaking out where those 2 pieces meet. Disc golf discs are typically made with a top and bottom mold. The parting line is where they meet in the center, and plastic often leaks out of that gap slightly and needs to be trimmed, leaving a faint line. Yeah! Remember, this is only part 1. Part 2 is coming with just a few more discs, including 5 different plastics. Dang it. This is getting heavy. If you enjoyed this video, you would also enjoy some of our other series, like The Disc is in the Details. Dang it, come on, spit it out. 300 A2.
Yeah, this one's just a beefcake.
Did you say beef?
Oh yeah, it's beef. It's beef jerky.
Nom nom nom.